Good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome our participants today for what will be a very interesting conversation with author Nicole Perlroth on her book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. I think an appropriately grippingly titled book to grab our attention and focus on an issue that deserves more attention. Nicole, thank you for doing the work on the book. Last year, cybersecurity made the headlines, as it does every year, but in a bigger way than normal. And, you know, I would say, unfortunately, the headline landed with the SolarWinds attack on American cyber infrastructure at a time of dramatic political developments, to say the least, with COVID and other distractions. You know, we have paid some attention to it, but we need to pay more attention to it. And your book lands at, I think, quite an interesting time. So thank you for coming to do this on the record discussion with us today about your book, the lessons that you reflect in there for us. I don't want to say too much because my bipartisan colleague, Chairman Mike Rogers, is with us here, and he's the guy that knows a lot about this topic. So I'm going to let him do the intro here, but I do want to just plug our very own Joshua Huminski's excellent work on a review of the book, which I recommend reading. And I will tell you, I've seen Joshua has reviewed a lot of books, and he recommended this one with stronger language than I've seen him recommend some other books. So let me just say, my take on his review is this is a book really well worth reading, in addition to my own sense of the importance of the topic. And I'm going to paste the book review in the chat for everyone. But without further ado, let me ask Mike to tee us up here, because Mike's the one who really understands this stuff. Mike, passing over to you.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for all your work at the center. Great work, Joshua, as well. Joshua Huminski on the review. I will echo that, Glenn. Pretty strong review for the book, Nicole. This is high praise from Joshua's review. So congratulations. And I say congratulations on this. It's a chronicle of a lot of really bad things put in context in a really difficult time with a very difficult topic. And I can't recommend the book more for folks who want to get a better understanding about really what's at stake. So Nicole, thanks for that. I have spent a lot of time on this, and you're right. If they're telling you that's how the world ends, I hate to say it, but they're right. You know, now the big national security debate is, can America survive first contact in a digital age? Meaning, if they come at us digitally before anything really bad happens, would we even be able to stand up what we need to do? A lot of people think that answer is uncertain. And I don't mean to underestimate that. I'm not trying to scare folks. It's just that we have so integrated in a digital age in our economy and our personal lives and even our social discourse in a way that the rest of the world has not. And we haven't really thought about putting security first. And there are consequences to that. And I think your book highlights that very, very well. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you for all that great work. I may join you going back to view the elephants. That's all I'm saying at that last piece of the book there. Thanks, Nicole, and I'll turn it over to you. Really great work.
Nicole, please.
All right, thank you so much.
And need to know.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for hosting me, and thanks for giving me context on Joshua's review. It was the best review I've read yet. And when I say best, I mean not just positive. It was just so thorough. And so I'm glad that these words of praise are not easily doled out, and I really appreciate it. On the book, you know, to me, one of the biggest challenges, I think, in cybersecurity is in understanding just how vulnerable we are, and the trade-offs that we make between our convenience and security, espionage and security, the economy and security, to the American public. I don't think that people truly understand the trade-offs that they make and that the government makes and that businesses make every day in terms of our security. So with that theme in mind, I had covered a lot of this in the New York Times. If people read my coverage in the Times, they'll recognize many of the stories in the book. And many of them appeared on the front page of the paper. But I felt like without stringing them together into a narrative, I was really doing my readers a disservice because it did not adequately communicate the place that we were headed to. So I joke that when I started at the New York Times about 10 years ago, people would warn me of a cyber Pearl Harbor, or cyber 9/11, cataclysmic attack that would take out the grid, unleash the gates at a dam, send airplanes crashing into one another. And they would say, until that happens, people really won't grasp what is at stake. And I would always ask, okay, so when are we going to see this attack? And almost comically, the answer was always the same: 18 to 24 months. That was the answer every time I asked: 18 to 24 months. It was just long enough that in case their prediction didn't come true, I might forget about it, but just short enough to add this urgency. And 10 years later, we have not had that cataclysmic attack. But I actually think we are somewhere maybe even worse, which is that everything that can be intercepted that is of value in the United States has been intercepted. The Chinese have carted off our intellectual property. We have caught Iranian hackers mucking around in our dams. We have seen North Korea decimate servers because they didn't like something about our free speech. And now we are unwinding a Russian attack. And before we even get there, we have seen Russia hack our election. We have seen Russia hack our grid. We have seen them hack our nuclear plants. We've seen cyber criminals hijack our hospitals, our towns and cities with ransomware. And now we are unwinding the attack that Representative Nye mentioned, SolarWinds, which I think people really don't understand just how pervasive that attack is. It hit us at the very agencies charged with keeping us safe: the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, the nuclear labs, Treasury, Commerce, State, Justice. And we know this actor, if it is who we think it is, this unit of the SVR, we know them from a hack on the State Department and the White House back in 2014, 2015. And what I remember from that attack was, in speaking to those who were remediating that attack, they described getting the Russian hackers out of our system, the equivalent of hand-to-hand digital combat. At one point, the hackers even took over the RSA Net Witness tool used to investigate the attack and manipulated it to make it harder for the investigators to find their back doors. So that is the adversary we are dealing with now. And I think it will be a long time before, say, we've eradicated them from our systems. And meanwhile, this new administration is going to have to figure out how to respond to an attack that A, we have pulled off successfully, but much more stealthily for a long time. And B, how to respond to an attack when we're not confident we've eradicated the adversary from our own systems. And this is a group, not necessarily this particular SVR group, but other Russian hackers have used these same access points for decimating data, for destruction, for turning off the lights. So this is a big deal. And yes, I was racing to finish the book for the election, and then COVID pushed it back and we got it out, and it got it out before SolarWinds, to SolarWinds. And I tried to write it in a really accessible way. I wanted my mom to be able to read it and understand what I've been up to for the past 10 years. And I really chose to focus on the incentives. And when I say the incentives, I mean the global arms market. Hackers who found that when they would find vulnerabilities in our software that could be used by adversaries, I went back and learned that, originally when they would bring these vulnerabilities to companies like Microsoft, like Oracle and Sun back in the day, the company's response typically was to ignore them or to threaten them with a lawsuit or just send their lawyer to make a threatening phone call. And meanwhile, governments have really realized that these vulnerabilities form valuable raw material for espionage and battlefield preparations. And for a long time, the United States participated in this market and led the market in terms of buying vulnerabilities from hackers in things like Microsoft Windows software and holding on to them because they helped our ability to monitor terrorists and our adversaries overseas. The problem is that over the last 10 years, what we've seen is other nation states, some are allies, some more dubious allies that don't have the same human rights track records as we do here and the same red tape, glom onto these same programs and turn a lot of their focus towards paying hackers to acquire these vulnerabilities for their espionage programs and surveillance programs. And we've also seen our adversaries do the same. At one point, we saw our own arsenal of vulnerabilities dumped online. Oh, did I lose you? Oh, you're still there.
It was just a technical hiccup, so we can still hear you.
Okay,
Go ahead.
sorry. Okay.
Okay.
At one point, we've seen our own arsenal of vulnerabilities dumped online, picked up by North Korea, picked up by Russia in an attack we call NotPetya, the most destructive, costly attack of all time. And it seems like with each passing cyber attack, each is a slightly deadlier version of the last, culminating with this attack just the other week on a water treatment facility. We don't know if that would be a nation state. A lot of people think it's more like an insider or disgruntled person somewhere, or maybe a Patriots fan. But someone got into the controls at a water treatment facility and upped the level of LYE in the water to the point where it could have been catastrophic had it not been caught in time. And so that's hardly a hard target. We have small municipalities all over the country that are charged with operating our critical infrastructure. Most of them are private companies, and they don't have the resources of a PG&E, and they don't have the security on staff, and they have to allow others to remote into their systems. And now we're seeing that hackers can exploit those access points for harm. And so, we still haven't had that catastrophic attack, but we're really close. And so the goal with writing the book was to say, hey, let's wake up, at all levels, individuals, as lame as it sounds and as annoying as it sounds, it is important that you run your software updates. It is important that you turn on multi-factor authentication and the passwords are gone. And that means that you need to create new passwords to different accounts. And you need to not click on these malicious links. And at the business level, we have to start designing these systems with the mindset that they can be broken into. And at the government level, we really have to make a concerted effort to identify critical infrastructure, to create incentives for those operators to meet basic standards of security, whether that's through tax credits or who knows what. And maybe even add some sticks to those who are using outdated software, not patching their systems in time, not using multi-factor authentication, because these attacks are coming. And my conclusion from the book and doing this research is the United States is still among, if not the most sophisticated actor in cyberspace. We have pulled off some of the most sophisticated cyber operations in the world. No one has us beat on that. But our adversaries have caught up in a much quicker time frame than we gave them credit for. Iran has really emerged from this digital backwater into one of the most prolific cyber armies on earth. I remember when you were in office, Chairman Rogers, we spent a lot of time talking about Chinese cyber espionage, and I was shocked last year to talk to security researchers, and they would tell me that now attacks out of Iran have eclipsed the amount of attacks they see from China in number. So our adversaries are pouring significant resources into these attacks and operations. The skills capabilities gap is closing. And we are also now the most targeted nation on earth by both nation state hackers and cyber criminals. because we have systems of interest. And we are the most vulnerable because we are among the most digitized countries on earth. So that's the book. I know that's a mouthful, and I'll let you ask me questions now, but the goal really was to make this an accessible read, and I've been really happy to see reviews like Joshua's that really grasp that. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you, Nicole. We are going to take questions, and Dan Mahaffey will help us field the audience questions. Let me encourage folks who are watching to please submit your questions when you're ready using the Q&A function, and we'll get those to Nicole. Nicole, maybe I can start by asking you a question that I have. You mentioned the capabilities that the United States possesses and the fact that adversaries have been catching up faster than we may have been prepared for. Can you talk, and this is kind of a broad question, but can you talk a little bit about your assessment of how well we have responded? Let's just use SolarWinds as an example of a moment when the issue was really highlighted around a set of vulnerabilities that involved the government's responsibility, how American private sector actors are involved, and were critically a part of the vulnerability that was present and manipulated. And the fact that in order to respond effectively, you need both sophisticated government actors, a public tuned in that cares, and policymakers who work in a more or less coordinated fashion around a set of goals that are accomplishable. Where are we on that spectrum? You mentioned that people had been telling you, we were 18 to 24 months away from a major attack. I mean, I would put the SolarWinds category in the major attack, only with, I will accept perhaps it didn't rise to the level of cataclysm, physical infrastructure damage, and the kinds of problems that we're seeing now from, for example, this winter storm that's hit the US really hard and damaged a lot of our infrastructure. But short of that, it's a big deal. So where are we on the spectrum of preparation, ability as a country, not just to have smart people in some government offices somewhere who understand the playing field, but national resilience to this kind of problem?
So, great question. So I'll start with talent pool. We have pulled off, and they're no secret, the most sophisticated attacks in the world. The attack that the United States pulled off with Israel on an Iranian nuclear facility that we call Stuxnet, to this day remains the most sophisticated attack ever pulled off. Unfortunately, it got out, and it showed the world what was possible with code. And we are very much on an asymmetrical battlefield here. We conduct cyber attacks out of Cyber Command at the Pentagon, and the NSA does its espionage operations. Other countries have the luxury of doing what China does, for instance, where some of the most sophisticated attacks in China are not coming from the PLA anymore. They don't even necessarily come from the Ministry of State Security. They come from these satellite contractors, many of whom are some of the top security engineers in the country, that the Ministry of State Security will tap on the shoulder and say, tonight you're moonlighting for us. We don't have that here. They also, in Russia, similarly, there is this, what has been described as sort of a pax mafiosa between the state and cyber criminals. And we saw this up close with the attack on Yahoo, where the attack was pulled off by cyber criminals. And then when they would find an email account of interest, a staffer at the White House, for instance, they would pass that off to the FSB agents. And like Putin said recently, he called cyber criminals artists that get up in the morning and paint, and he has no control over them. So they really have a degree of plausible deniability that we don't have here. All of our attacks come from inside government. We don't tap the engineer at Google on the shoulder at night and say, tonight you're coming to work for us. And so we are facing somewhat of a talent shortage for those reasons, and also because some of the top hackers that we have in the United States have such lucrative job opportunities at Google, at Facebook, at Microsoft, Amazon, and at security companies like FireEye. That said, we are still pulling off some of the most sophisticated attacks. I always joke, I'm not avoiding the NSA attacks in my coverage. It's just that no one ever catches them. So I spend a lot of time talking about and Russia is doing. No one ever seems to detect what our own intelligence agencies are doing. That said, clearly we cannot rely on offense alone to outsmart our enemies, because we just missed the biggest, most pervasive cyber attack on our government systems, and we still don't know the extent of that. And Russia brilliantly exploited our supply chain. When I would go around and call some of these victims, most of them didn't even know they used SolarWinds, let alone that most of SolarWinds build operations and where they build their code and test their code are in Eastern Europe now. Not to say that that's fundamentally less secure, but we don't know what's in our supply chain. And it's even worse when you look at open source protocols, the parts of code that make its way into proprietary code. We found a vulnerability in an open source security protocol a couple of years ago that was used by everyone from Amazon to the FBI. And when we took a closer look, it was run by two guys named Steve in the UK who were operating on a shoestring $3,000 budget. So we don't know what's in our tools, and Russia brilliantly exploited that. And they pulled off the attack from inside servers at GoDaddy and others in the United States where the NSA is not looking. So they have our number. And then in terms of the public's understanding, what makes SolarWinds difficult in terms of waking up the American public is, and this is good news, we know that it was aimed at espionage. We know that ultimately what it appears that they were after were emails and strategy documents and that kind of thing. But I think what needs to be made more clear without terrifying people is that those same access points have and can be used by Russia for much darker purposes, as they did in Ukraine, where they basically decimated government systems. I went to Ukraine 2 years after the NotPetya attack, and they were still not up to speed. Their postal service was still not working up to snuff. The railway was still having trouble. But during that attack, people could not get gas. They couldn't pay for gas at the gas station. They couldn't get money out of the ATM. Things were pretty bleak. And as I was leaving Ukraine, the security researchers I talked to stopped just short of sort of grabbing me by the ears and saying, Nicole, they turned off the lights here. They decimated our government data, but they only turned off the lights for 6 hours. And from what we can see in dissecting those attacks, this was them pulling off the scientific method of cyber attacks. They were testing one tool here, one tool there, seeing what they could do. It was very clear that this was an experiment and that the ultimate target wasn't us, it's you. It's you in the United States. And when it comes for you, it's going to be a lot worse because you are so much more wired. And so I don't think that has really trickled down to the American public yet. We have all bought into this promise. I'm based in Silicon Valley. We've bought into Silicon Valley's promise of a frictionless society and all the convenience that entails. And that has come at a trade-off to security. There are just some systems that, had we been thinking more clearly, should have never been connected to the internet, or at least should have been designed in a way that they were segmented or air-gapped from everything and anything else. And we are way past that point. And my point in the book and putting it out now is it's still not too late. We are very much on the cusp of the Internet of Things. We are connecting new devices to the internet, insulin pumps, pacemakers, the grid, traffic lights, at a rate of 127 new devices a second. But we are still at the cusp of virtualization and artificial intelligence. So hopefully, now that we've seen these close calls, things like this book can help educate the public and what the stakes are and how these vulnerabilities work and what the trade-offs are, so that we can come up with a more coherent national strategy. But to your original question, we have not figured out deterrence. Sanctions have not worked. Indictments did not work. Indictments were largely symbolic because China and Russia don't extradite members of the PLA or their cyber criminals or members of the FSB. And clearly, we have sanctioned and indicted members of the GRU, and it did not stop them from pulling off this attack. And we have also attacked the Russian grid in retaliation for their attacks on our grid and their attacks on our election. My colleague David Sanger and I broke that story a couple of years ago, and that has not deterred them from these continuing attacks. Now, we don't know, maybe it deterred them from hacking the election this time, and that is an open question. Or maybe they saw a really great opportunity while we were also focused on the election to hack into these systems that would be of more interest down the road if a President Biden won.
Thank you. In just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Mahaffey to field, because we do have a significant number of audience questions now. I just wanted to respond to your point about resilience. It sounds like education is a big part of that. Awareness across the board among our citizenry is vital. You can't have a cybersecurity strategy that works with just technical experts. You've got to have citizens who are aware at the cyber hygiene level. It's an argument we've made for some time, which is that we need to reorient our education system to help Americans understand not only the digital economy, in other words, what am I agreeing to when I sign up for this app, but also the security implications of interacting in this world that we're generating, connections around, deep connections, as you've suggested. And I give a lot of credit to Mike Rogers for highlighting the 5G component of that threat and how it's changing without most of our realizing it. Our vulnerability to our day-to-day life and livelihood and very way of life in terms of what we're connecting at rapid speeds now. So thank you for raising those points. Let me go ahead and turn over to Dan, because we got a lot of interest from the audience for their questions. Dan, why don't you take over?
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Nicole. We've got some great questions here, so folks, if you can please continue to put those into the Q&A box, we'll get to them. One of the first questions here, and I'll just have to go with it because of the terminology here, refers to the effing salmon, and talks about the way that zero-day brokers had a sort of apathy or cavalier attitude towards their practice, and a thread in your book about the this effing salmon. I imagine it's not about the locks I put on my bagel. So what is about that, and what does it tell us about the mindset of these hackers?
So the effing salmon story is one of my favorite dinners I have been to since I joined the Beat 10 years ago. I was at Dale Peterson's S4 conference, which is a conference that just focuses on the vulnerabilities of our critical infrastructure. And I was seated next to Ralph Langner, who is a specialist in industrial control security, no longer, but I still consider him an expert in the space. And he was actually the first to have the chutzpah to call out the United States and Israel for being the authors of Stuxnet. And also at our table were two Italian hackers who'd come to the conference from Malta, and they had a new startup called Revon. And their business model was to sell 0 days, which are holes, unpatched holes in software that the manufacturer doesn't know about, to sell 0 days in ICS software, industrial control software, to governments. So we're at this dinner, and I was dying to know to which governments would they sell this code, and to which governments would they not. And so I waited until we'd had our glasses of wine, and I finally summoned the courage to ask Luigi, who spoke the better English of the two. I said, so Luigi, who will you sell your 0 days to? And who will you not sell them to? Iran, China? And it was the second time I think I tried to ask the question, and he just stared down at his salmon for a long time. It was an awkward pause. And finally he said, I could answer your question, but I'd rather talk about my salmon. And Ralph, who spends his life going around making sure that a Deutsche Bahn train wasn't going to careen off the tracks, or we wouldn't see the equivalent of Stuxnet on a power plant in the United States only used for destruction, just erupted and turned to me and said, Nicole, these men are young. They have no idea what they're doing or where this will go. And then he turned back to Luigi and he said, but tell us about your effing salmon. And the story, I used it to introduce the reader to this dynamic in the cyber arms industry, in the zero-day market. 0 days, again, are just these holes in code that can be exploited for espionage, but also destruction. No one wanted to talk about this market. No one wanted to talk about the fact that they trade in vulnerabilities, not just for espionage, not just to enable our ability to monitor terrorists and adversaries, but that they trade also in code that can be used for a destructive cyber attack on our critical infrastructure. And the fact that Luigi wanted to discuss his salmon and not address the question just became emblematic to me of the fact that no one in this market wanted to talk about it. And so throughout the book, whenever I ask someone a question about their customers and they refuse to answer, I back up and say that effing salmon. And Dale Peterson, who runs the conference, actually ran a blog post. Now, to be fair, he said he remembered the conversation similarly. He doesn't remember Ralph using the F word, although Ralph did not deny it. And he said that actually Luigi genuinely seemed very interested in his salmon and was not ducking the question so much as really wanted to discuss the crispiness of his salmon skin. And I'm not buying it. So that's that story.
Several of the other questions here in this thread ask about the idea of developing some level of international agreement or a framework on state behavior in cyberspace or creating cyber norms. What are your thoughts on the prospects of that, and perhaps how some of these lessons about when these things fall into wrong hands or get in the open, is that waking up policymakers to perhaps build some rules for the road?
I think there's been a lot of proposals that sound wonderful in theory, and many of which I agree with. Should we create international norms, for example, that say you cannot hack hospitals, you cannot hack the power grid, you cannot hack our elections? That sounds terrific in theory because we are facing many attacks on our grid. Our elections in 2016 obviously became a big target, and that won't be the last time that happens. And our hospitals are under a relenting wave of ransomware attacks. Unfortunately, as a matter of practicality, as I mentioned before, we might agree to that, but we pull off all of our own attacks from Cyber Command. Other countries outsource many of those attacks to contractors or to cyber criminals in some cases. And so how do you create international norms where it would be easy for Putin, for example, to say, that wasn't me, that was these artists or these cyber criminals. I have nothing to do with their attack on your hospital or your election. And some would even say that they've really structured their cyber operations to be able to say that, to be able to have maximum plausible deniability. So it gets very difficult in the details. As far as, what was the second part of the question? Sorry, Dan. Oh, you're on mute.
Are we seeing among policymakers any efforts to start to move forward on that, to start to chart these rules? There are proposals, but is there dialogue yet internationally?
Some of the interesting international discussions just on the zero-day trade and the cyber arms trade took place under Wassenaar. Wassenaar doesn't make the rules, but members of the Wassenaar arrangement agree to have these discussions, come to these agreements, and then each domestically go back home and put these rules into laws. And a couple of years ago, they tried to put in place rules that would prevent the sale of intrusion software. And much of the penetration testing community pushed back and argued successfully, for the most part, that intrusion technology is dual use technology. It can be used to spy on a system. It can also be used to test a system for vulnerabilities and to patch those systems and leave that system more secure. So when you put rules on intrusion software, you could just as easily be handicapping defense, even if your goal was to stop the sale of spyware to authoritarian governments, like even some of our allies, like Saudi Arabia, who've been caught using these on Americans like Jeff Bezos, and people like Jamal Khashoggi. So that rule ended up getting watered down a little bit. I believe the ultimate language was, I actually can't even remember what the ultimate language was, but the United States actually never implemented those rules. And what was interesting was, and largely because of the pushback, not just from the penetration testing community, but from Google and some digital rights activists who argued that this really would handicap the free flow of information and defensive technology. But what happened after the fact is that a lot of the major zero-day sellers and traders and spyware developers, after we refused to put those laws into place, moved to the Beltway. They saw that the United States would be more tolerant and open to some of their business practices. And so ViewPen, for instance, which was based in France, and sells catalog subscriptions to zero-day exploits and readily advertises to hackers that they'll pay you as much as $2.5 million for a way into your Android or iPhone. They are now rebranded as Zerodium, and they are based around Washington, D.C. And we've seen a lot of these companies that we formerly knew under one name now operate under a different name in the United States. So as far as rules, I think we are not headed towards a place where we are interested in regulating the sale of some of those tools. That said, what some in the penetration testing business will say is that our export controls on encryption technology that we've had in place for a long time do require some sellers of zero days and spyware to get a license to sell to a foreign country. And I think it also requires that they report some of their sales numbers and the customers that they're working with, and that it would impede their ability to sell some of these tools to countries like Iran or Cuba or even Bolivia or other governments. So that might be true, but I think the problem is policymakers really don't understand what this business is. And that was part of the reason I wanted to write this book. I wanted people to understand what the stakes are here. It is not an easy space. There are no easy answers. There are no silver bullets. But I think for too long, we've really allowed the information security community and the penetration testing community and those who were profiting off the lack of regulation lead these discussions, and they make some excellent points. But I think it is time for people to really understand what this business is, what the trade-offs are, and so we can have these discussions among the American public and come up with rules that actually make sense, that don't handicap us when it comes to our own offensive operations and handicap our defense.
To field some questions on solar wind and some of the a bunch of them have sort of this same theme here, and diving down on the parlance and whether you want to refer to that as necessarily an attack or an act of espionage, and how and in how we speak about that, what your thoughts are on on that line, given that, I assume, if the U.S. weren't doing espionage like that, many would say we want our tax dollars back, because that's what we assume they're doing. So does that also affect our ability to respond when you have that fine line of the espionage that countries do compared to attacking systems per se?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Thomas Rid at Johns Hopkins is really on top of this topic. He thinks that we should not call these attacks cyber attacks, that we should really refer to them as cyber espionage, because cyber attack gets us more towards the act of war, and then what are the repercussions from using that language and terminology. So in my mind, what SolarWinds is cyber espionage, right? We know that they were after emails and strategy documents, and we know that they did it using our own vulnerabilities in our own software. And it would be a cyber attack if they did what they did to Ukraine or to Pfizer or FedEx or any of the companies that got caught up in the 2017 NotPetya attack, when it really paralyzed systems. I would put that in the category of attack, and certainly cyber insurers did, because they still haven't paid out a lot of the cyber insurance policies from that, because they know war exemption in these companies' contracts if you are subject to an act of war. So clearly, these have real implications. Sorry, I just lost you in my headphones. Can you hear me, Dan?
Yeah, your video has gone still. We can still hear you.
So hopefully you can still hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, your audio has been fine. We just lost video briefly.
Okay. So what I would say was, we have pulled off these attacks for a long time. We have hacked into the supply chain. We have used these vulnerabilities for our own espionage operations. And yes, really,
Nicole, it appears you've gone muted now and sideways.
okay. Hold on, let me see. Is that better?
That is better, yes.
Okay, sorry, headphone technical difficulties. So yes, so it really does impede our ability to respond, because we have pulled off these supply chain attacks ourselves for a very long time. And how do you respond to something that you yourself have done and are probably most likely currently doing as we speak?
In terms too of the getting the right talent, we obviously talk about the various groups involved, non-state hackers, criminal groups that other countries use. What are the ways that we think that we can close it in the US? Is it recruiting in the US? Is it a matter of money in the right fields? We've got some questions here. Do we need to have privateers in cyberspace? The Constitution says you can issue letters of marque. Do we need to follow that model?
It's such a good question. And I thought about it for the book because, and this was awkward because I'm a journalist and we usually outline the problems and then we provide zero solutions and leave that to policymakers. But on this point, I felt like I really needed to toss out some suggestions. So my suggestion on that is, clearly we face a talent shortage. When we do get the best hackers into government, the line has always been, it's more fun to be a pirate than it is to be in the Coast Guard. Most people want to join NSA and don't necessarily want to join DHS. But a lot more want to join the Googles of the world where they can get the perks and the salaries and the benefits. So my idea for this was, why don't we do tours of duty? Why don't we ask some of the top brass at some of the tech companies in Silicon Valley to go spend 1 year or 2 years at NSA or at DHS, and then spend 2 years volunteering to work on behalf of a critical infrastructure provider in the United States, so they get a sense for how difficult it is to be an IT administrator before they go back to their companies. And why don't we set it up so they don't have to take the biggest pay cut to do that, where we would partner with these companies? And isn't it in our collective interest to do something like that so we can incentivize the best hackers and cryptographers among us to really spend time on cyber defense? So that's my one suggestion. I've also thought about, at Google, they developed Project Zero, which they do take some of their best engineers and they turn them on some of the most widely used software in the world, antivirus software, Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS software, and they find holes and they give the companies 90 days to patch them. I think that's still the timeline. Why don't we sponsor something like that in government? Why don't we pay hackers to find these holes in critical infrastructure systems to get them patched? With SolarWinds, what we learned after the fact, it had no way of knowing, hackers had no way of contacting the company with a major vulnerability. They're changing that very quickly right now. And they were warned internally that if they didn't make a bigger commitment to their security, it would lead to a catastrophe. And we are witnessing that right now because they were in so many systems. So, and my other idea was, why don't we at least do an inventory to understand what software is touching our systems, what tools are in the tools, how much of it is American made, and work our way back from there, because the basic problem is just we don't know what's in our systems. We really don't. And in this case, Russia used even the tools that would give us more visibility into our networks against us. So it's time to take stock of the software that touches our most critical systems and find new ways, creative ways to secure it.
In terms of also we have some questions here about the whole marketplace for cyber defense and how is that working, and your thoughts on that. It kind of follows on to what you said there. Is there anyone in government responsible for trying to push forward cyber defense solutions or help to build that private sector marketplace? And then the second part of this, and we can go back to that too, is the cyber insurance marketplace. Is that, we talk about there's some attacks that are, above the level that they cover. And then on the other hand, the payouts just seem to incentivize further ransom taking. Is that marketplace broken?
I do think it's broken. I'll take the last one first. I do think it's broken because clearly the insurance providers have seen that it is cheaper to pay ransoms than it is to pay to build these systems back up from scratch. And there is a perverse incentive there. But, just recently there were some discussions around this, and there were discussions about whether we should make paying ransoms illegal. I don't know whether that is the right answer, but clearly we have a problem, because I covered the first story about ransomware, I think back in 2012, when it was just popping up in Europe and the ransoms were $300. And now, last year, I think the highest ransom I heard paid out was something like $23 million. And these are hitting our hospitals in the middle of a pandemic. And these are not these are not big budgeted hospitals that they're hitting. So yes, it is not working. There are perverse incentives, but I also think it could be a very big carrot to companies if cyber insurance providers said, we're not going to cover you unless you subject yourself to real penetration testing, not the compliance checklists, but to real hackers coming in and trying to get into your system. And if they can get in, we're not going to cover you. And I haven't seen that level of due diligence yet from the cyber insurance industry. It might be getting there, but I haven't seen it. On the other question of who does defense, I mean, fortunately, we created CISA at the Department of Homeland Security, which became famous under Chris Krebs during the election. And CISA, they are headed in the right direction. But, we live in a free market society. Most of our critical infrastructure, something like 80%, is run by private companies. Anytime there has been proposed legislation with real teeth that would push critical infrastructure operators to have top security or face consequences, that legislation has always been watered down by lobbyists who say it's too burdensome on the companies. Also, after Snowden, the last thing private companies wanted, particularly in Silicon Valley, was any kind of situation where the NSA or even the Department of Homeland Security would have access to their networks and be able to block attacks or see attacks in real time on their systems. That was going to be a note that no one was going to agree to that after Snowden. What countries like Israel have on us is the government has far more access to these systems, and they also do have conscription. They do have members of, young members of 8200 that are blocking these threats in real time. We don't have that here. So we have to work with the system that we have. And, it is my opinion that we need to have real carrots and sticks here. And I do think something like tax credits for companies that pass serious penetration testing tests, and sticks for those who are using outdated software like Windows XP and just are not patching their systems on any real schedule. I do think there should be real penalties for that. But these are all discussions for the new administration. But currently, whatever we've been doing to this point, it hasn't been working.
Looking at where we are on the clock here, I'm going to combine some of these final questions we have here and ones that are more forward-looking in a way. The one question cites the example, Huawei in China, they've proposed a new internet architecture. We know their interests in proposing that, but they also highlight that security is the forethought. So that's on the hardware and software side of building for security, but also educating people for security. So how do we build the networks as well as the users in the future to be more security focused in your mind?
That's such a good question, and it really is just out of my wheelhouse because it is more technical. But what I have learned from these attacks is we need to be building these systems not to get the product to market first, but we need to build them with the threats in mind. We need to be segmenting our crown jewels, whatever that means. For me, on an individual level, it means my sources. I just have sources. I don't communicate with them in any kind of digital capacity. I have one source that I would meet for dim sum on the first Tuesday of every month during the pandemic, and we never brought our devices. For a water treatment facility, should a hacker or a contractor have the ability to increase the lye in your water from 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million? No. That is worth probably the funding to have someone on premises who's been authenticated and vetted to be able to access that control. In government, the good news with SolarWinds is it does not appear that they got into classified systems, but from what I'm told, there was still a lot to be collected on unclassified systems. For instance, Black Start at the Department of Energy, this very technical document that lists kind of a to-do list if we were to have a catastrophic power failure like the one we're seeing in Texas right now, in terms of where we would go first and second and third to get the power back on. That document in an adversary's hands could be very valuable in an attack where they want to keep the power off. So something like Black Start, we should have wrapped additional protections around that. So, all I have to say on this is we have been designing every system with accessibility, speed, and convenience in mind. And now we need to start designing these systems with security in mind. And unfortunately, it will create lag times. It will create inconveniences that we now take for granted. But we are at a place where the cost of doing nothing is so much higher than the cost of doing something and entertaining these annoyances and lag times, that it's really important that we educate the public so they understand what those trade-offs are.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, one question put it excellently here. You know, how do we get people to focus on the real threats, not Q? Is one way, but you know that the real world threats are big enough on their own for us to face. So thank you, Nicole, for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Glenn. Thank you.
Well, I just want to echo the thanks, Nicole, for doing the work on the book, and for highlighting this important issue, and as you suggested, taking what was a career worth of work on these stories and bringing them together into a readable combined narrative that really makes it, I think, a product which can help influence the debate here on how we prepare ourselves as a country. The book is This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyberweapons Arms Race. Nicole, I guess we learned today that it's going to end within 18 to 24 months, but it's always 18 or 24 months away in some people's minds. But I think among the participants on this call today, and among those of us at CSPC that are concerned about these questions, you know, we think it may be even more urgent than that. So I think we share your sense of the urgency here. So thank you very much for spending the hour with us and sharing your thoughts and your work on this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks for the excellent questions. And hopefully we'll keep the conversation going.
Thanks everybody for joining us for the session. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.